In the spring of 1941, Britain braced for the Nazi invasion that Hitler had promised would follow the Blitz.
There'll be bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover. Tomorrow, just you wait and see.
In Canada, one film would capture that moment like no other.
The Straits of Dover, no wider than the St. Lawrence, no wider than the Mississippi. On one side, the greatest machine of conquest of all time. On the other, the white ramparts of Britain.
With Churchill's Island, the National Film Board of Canada caught the attention of the world, riveting audiences across the US, Canada, and the Commonwealth with a force we can still feel today.
Night and day the watching eyes gaze seaward. None can say when the hour of invasion may come, but come, they believe it will.
It won the first Oscar for documentary, and still stands out for its masterful combination of words and images.
It was just such people as these who bore the full brunt of the first German onslaught on England, the all-out air attack of September 1940. Long will England remember the days when the Spitfires and the Hurricanes first roared in, and the fortunes of war were written in white trails of vapor in the sky.
Churchill's Island is a classic in the history of wartime propaganda. One episode in two immensely successful series that would play in theaters throughout the war. For most of the world, these are the films that made the NFB a legend in the rise of documentary. But the real story of the board's early years, the story this film tells, is not about convincing us to die for our country, but rather convincing us we had a country worth dying for.
Tomorrow, when the world is free.
The Film Board produced over 500 films during the war, and I've watched all but a missing few. Take it from me, you don't want to do this. There are precious few Churchill's Islands among a sea of pedestrian subjects. But I wasn't necessarily looking for masterpieces. As a lifelong documentary filmmaker myself, born just after the war, I wanted to see how we saw ourselves then, and how we presented Canada to Canadians and the world. For most of the past 2 centuries, we'd defined ourselves through Britain and the Empire, proud to share its values and its prejudices. And we reaffirmed all those in spades during the royal visit of 1939.
As the King and Queen crossed Dominion in triumphal progress, the world saw a strong young democracy on parade, full of pride in its maturity.
The National Film Board would be the first effort to describe ourselves in our own terms. How they did that was in these films, and that was what I was looking for. Although most don't stand the test of time, a few films rise above, a lasting credit to their makers. Altogether, mundane and inspired, they somehow worked. They hooked us, and these early days would take on legendary status, especially to my generation of filmmakers. I wanted to open the archives and see Canada through their eyes again, see if I could find in it the Canada we know today. What I found? Well, you'll see what I found, and you can decide how much it resembles your Canada. But I can tell you now that it was the boldest and most successful propaganda effort in our history, which turned out, like so much in wartime, to be both heroic and unexpectedly disturbing. The man behind it was a visionary Scot with fire in his belly and a bee in his bonnet. At the time he arrived in Canada in 1938, few men on earth had thought or written more about the uses of documentary film than John Grierson. In 1926, he had coined the term documentary. In Depression England, he had defined the genre and recruited the likes of W.H. Auden and Benjamin Britten to its service. In films like Coalface, they elevated the British working man from dull-witted drudge to lion-hearted nobility.
He has scarcely room to swing his pick.
Letters of thanks, letters from banks, letters of joy from the girl and the boy received.
In Night Mail, they created blood-quickening excitement from the mundane work of the post office.
News circumstantial, news financial, letters with holiday snaps to enlarge in, letters with faces scrawled in the margin, letters from uncles, cousins and aunts, letters to Scotland from the south of France, letters of condolence to...
In 1938, Prime Minister King asked Grierson to come to Ottawa and advise him on Canada's film policy. The result, in 1939, was an act establishing the National Film Board. Within a year, King had made it the only producer of government films, with John Grierson in sole control. For Grierson, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. And for Canada, too, for this was one of those shining moments in history when the man and the task at hand are perfectly matched. With the Prime Minister's backing, Grierson had the clout to cut through red tape and step on toes with impunity. He would enjoy this singular trust until almost the end of the war. And with it, he would make history. Though passionate about the idea of democracy, Grierson himself was a dictator who dismissed critics and punished resistance. Domineering and charismatic, he could elevate with a smile or crush with a look. He saw documentary film as a hammer to shape society, as propaganda for democracy in what he called the war for men's minds. So when the directive came down from the Prime Minister to get Canadians behind the war, his answer was characteristically pithy. We must take Canadians by the throat and convince them they are a great people. How do we do that on film? Answer me that one. That last question was presumably rhetorical, but it is the question that inspired this film. In 1940, the term Canadian was attached to 11 million people, strung out along 6,000 kilometers of railway, with only CBC radio to connect them. The meaning of Canadian depended very much on where you got off the train. Many still considered themselves proud sons and daughters of the Empire. But for others, Les Canadiens meant those who had been here long before Wolfe's invasion. And for many more, it was a break with the past, a leap of faith into a future that would be neither British nor French. Still others were largely left out, Canadian only by conquest and colonization. Grierson was convinced that if his NFB could find the threads that linked all Canadians and show us a nation we could all belong to, a unified war effort was in the bag. He moved into an old lumber mill on John Street in Ottawa and began hiring staff. He said he wanted nationalists who had the bug of being Canadian and a burning need to spread it. His favorite insult was arty. They were to leave art to others. In return, he offered them a once-in-a-lifetime privilege to be the first to create a picture of Canada and Canadians on motion picture film. He told them that while excellent camera work was crucial, it was really no more than gathering raw material. The real places films were made were the typewriter and the cutting room. where their shots would be put at the service of a message that had been determined long before the first foot of film had been shot. They were not discovering Canada, they were describing it. Grierson showed them what he meant with the first film he'd produced after coming to Canada, back when the war still seemed safely distant.
Canada's experts have the inside dope. What's the score, Canada wants to know? If they win tonight, they lead the league.
Hot Ice is a beautiful illustration of Grierson's notion of democratic propaganda. In a favorite phrase, it must make peace as exciting as war. It must stress what unites us, not what tears us apart. Above all, it must exalt what was then called the common man.
Wherever they are, whatever they're doing, whenever Canadians get together, hockey is new. Crowds of them, gay, hopeful, good-natured crowds with faith in their own spirit. Can I have my ticket, please? Precious tickets, put aside months in advance, so no one will be left out on the big night. Not the prosperous broker, nor the mining men and their women, not the old-timers, nor the guy giving his gal a break. In a little while, they'll suddenly become wild and warm and one with each other. It's the crowd that makes hockey a beautiful thing, like a national folk dance. The hockey star...
In his superb narration, novelist Morley Callahan even brings the larger-than-life hockey stars
all the gold in the North Country couldn't buy you a membership in this club.
into the circle of the common man.
They're regular fellows, these idols, ordinary human beings who skated out ahead. With millions of other lads, they've come right out of the heart of Canada. Hockey players go in any place where the ice comes early and the thaw comes late. In shimmy, the only rule is every man for himself.
Gradually, hockey becomes a metaphor for Canadian values and a crucible forging the national character.
You're in there with just a stick, and you'll learn how to use it the hard way. But practice is the only thing that really teaches. Long hours spent in learning to stop short, in learning how to take a tumble.
Deftly, almost casually, Callahan slips in the anti-fascist message.
Do you think people who go for stuff like this will ever let themselves be pushed around, mister? They'll find a way through.
Getting after it, and Neil Corvo beat him to it.
Propaganda for sure, but propaganda with truth at its heart and a smile on its face.
Now Campman and Apps. Apps takes the pass, going over the line, back to Davidson. He shoots, he scores! And that's the equalizer. It's 1-1.
Sure we like it. Sure we're proud of the fastest game on earth. It's ours, it's us. And back there in the country, we're making its future.
Back there in the country was where most Canadians still lived in 1939. Their films reflect that, even as they try to project a message more appropriate to war. For instance, right from the beginning, they like to tell us that Canada was a modern industrial powerhouse. But the truth was otherwise. 10 years of the Great Depression had slowed modernization to a standstill, especially on the farm. Small homesteads that held on did it with horsepower, wood stoves, and oil lamps. Cities had problems of their own. As the narrator of this film says,
even before the war, the shortage of decent housing was acute.
And with the war, it would only get worse. And chances were, if you had a job in the pre-war economy, it involved hard labor and sweat. That was true if you were a West Coast lumberjack, felling the giant Douglas fir with hand tools.
1 hour, 2 hours, till the undercut is deep enough for gunning. Then a turn at the crosscut saw for an hour more.
Or bobbing in a dory on the North Atlantic.
To haul steadily with bare hands over the wheel, the 3 miles of fish-filled lines is hard, hard work.
Or shoveling loose coal, miles from the nearest gleam of sunlight.
Man may shovel as much as 10 to 12 tons in a day.
Even office work was tougher then. The day went until 6 p.m., and the weekend began at noon on Saturday. Yet these were the lucky ones before World War II. Unemployment was rife in 1939, and the only thing approaching a safety net was relief, a few grudging dollars a week in return, usually, for soul-destroying labor. This was the Canada, sprawling, diverse, disconnected, that by late 1940, the NFB's cameras were fanning out to capture. Their films quickly took on a few recognizable forms. A common one was a portrait of a place seen through the work and lives of its people. These were usually rural, and endless photogenic vistas made the Maritimes a favorite. There was little story and much information, but the intent was to introduce Canadians to their distant neighbors, a completely new experience in this pre-television era. We, had literally never seen each other's lives, had no way to do so, something almost inconceivable in this century of the internet. So novelty alone made these films a wonder. And while they seldom dug below the surface, they used names and close-ups wherever possible, and in the simplest of scenes could find moments that were at once particular to one village, yet universally familiar.
The small general store is a meeting place for all. This is Percy Tanner's store. He was a fisherman once. His sons are fishermen today. His daughter Lou tends the store with him. Thelma Tanner in bright checks, home for a weekend from a wartime factory job in Halifax, is glad to see Gerald. For these wartime days, most of the Blue Rocks boys are in the armed services, and alone the girls now sip their soft drinks.
As befits a committed Democrat, the point of view that flowed down from Grierson to the films was that of the aforementioned common man. Grierson liked to say he was 1 inch to the left of any government he worked for. And these movies generally bear that out. Democracy was the watchword, but through the eyes of Grierson's boys and girls, as he liked to call them, it was a populist democracy of ordinary working folks with hardly a banker, industrialist, or mining baron in sight. And that 1 inch to the left part was not especially hidden.
To all dorymen goes the same amount, for work on a fishing schooner is truly cooperative.
In 1 year, over $165,000 was distributed in cash returns to the members of this cooperative.
Pierre's father remembers when the fishermen sold their catch to buyers for a pittance. He remembers when they were always in debt to the dealers who staked them with the gear they were too poor to own. It is different now.
In other films, they promoted community activism.
But the women wouldn't take no for an answer.
I've made out 10 good reasons why Oakers should have a health unit.
Everybody's with you. I have the signature of every woman in the Hamilton district.
And so it would go, right through the war. Democracy meant more than just a vote every 4 or 5 years. Predictably enough, that inch to the left occasionally ran up against the official message, such as when strikes threatened crucial wartime coal production. Labor relations in the coal mines were chronically hostile, largely because mine owners could be callous exploiters. When Graham McInnes's first script was too direct about that, the sponsor, the Department of Labor, yanked the reins. This was not the appropriate message for wartime. Grierson agreed, and McInnes obediently rewrote. Then, he and director Robert Edmonds set about telling their own story between the lines. Coalface is a mixture of drama and documentary, a docudrama in today's terms. The protagonist is Bruce Adams, a discharged soldier who lost his father years ago in a pit explosion. Back in Coal Town, Bruce doesn't want to return to the mine.
All former miners go back to the pit.
Well, is that so awful?
Bloody.
My dad's a miner. He's been a miner all his life.
I'm sorry. No, I'm not.
Bruce can't shake his bitterness over the bump that killed his dad, here beautifully recreated through the camera work of Joseph Braun. Very possibly, poor safety conditions were to blame, but that was one of the things the script didn't, and probably couldn't, say. Through the strain on the waiting faces, played by genuine mining families, the filmmakers make clear another point not in the script. When things go wrong in the mine, it's the miners who pay the price. The filmmakers get another chance to slip in their message when Bruce sees an old friend's payslip.
Wash house 50 cents, blacksmith 50 cents. Haven't they thought of a new gag yet?
Let me tell you about the deductions they used to make. There was...
And I don't want to hear about it.
But it's better in the mines now with the union and the bosses thinking more about the men.
Now look at that statement.
Boy, you all know we need more coal.
But when we see a workers' meeting, a tame union boss delivers the official line. Shut up and dig.
And I know the things you're beefing about. But you can't get anywhere by just calling names. Greater coal production can be achieved only by putting together all the brains and effort of all of us.
Bruce mulls it over as he takes an unlikely but striking walk among the coke ovens. In the end, what changes his mind seems less patriotic duty than his connection to the community of mining families, and the return of that C word. You know, the one that's code for socialist.
He came to one of our cooperative housing projects, and he saw the neighborly little things that give our mining town their strength.
I do hope we'll finish before Mother and Dad will get here.
There was a miner and his wife worrying over a paint job, but Coal Town's a friendly place.
Going fishing?
Yeah.
Are you all going fishing, fellas?
Yeah, you right. Got any worms?
Ah, gee, fellas, you shouldn't have done this.
He was finding out the way miners all over the world have built communities that have a strength and a faith in themselves. Next day, Bruce Adams reported for duty with the night shift.
From this distance, it's fun watching the filmmakers struggle against what they saw as unfair, not to say misleading, demands by the sponsoring department. But they too had their own agenda, or rather Grierson's, to carry out. To find the values and characteristics that all Canadians could share and agree on. The kernel of national unity. Soon enough, they arrived at a simple but powerful formula. Regardless of whether it was true or not, these films portray Canadians everywhere as sharing three basic virtues: a deep belief in democratic freedoms, fearlessness in the face of hard work, and a healthy combination of self-reliance and mutual support. As their cameras traveled west, the climate and landscape changed dramatically, but the narrative stayed on message.
The vast spaces of Western Canada breed hardy men, like the Indian cowboy in big hat, bright shirt, and worn leather chaps. They work hard, 11 hours a day in the saddle sometimes. It takes teamwork, 5 men working together to handle 1,400 head.
Teamwork wasn't exactly a workers' co-op, but it was as much as you were likely to get from this band of individualists. Elsewhere in the foothills, they recorded the transition of Alberta's engine of wealth from the land to what lay under it. Seen, of course, through the eyes of the working stiff.
The worker, returning to his home after a hard day's work, sees a new drama in the land. For if from one window gleam the flames of oil, from another he sees evidence of the wealth of cattle ranching. Cowboys and oilmen rub shoulders in the rough streets of oil towns, dusty and sweating with the labor of the oil field.
These films fit the Grierson propaganda model just as much as Coalface, not by distorting reality, but by choosing it. Cheerful and superficial, there would be no digging into regional resentments or peculiar prairie politics. Films from this part of the country were all about newness and tomorrow. And speaking of tomorrow,
along the shores of the Athabasca River in northern Alberta are the famous black tar sands. These sandbanks along the river are often so full of petroleum that it oozes out onto the surface. Here lies a reserve which someday may yield great quantities of oil. Around these new mining areas will grow the settlements of the future.
Among these portrait or profile films, the hands-down winner, at least for me, is Jane Marsh's poignant study of life on a habitant farm.
The Angelus is ringing. Through the village of Lazy Bull Moss, it is ringing the hour of evening. Home from cutting the first hay of the season turns Alexis Tremblay, thrifty farmer of Lazy Bull Moss. And Marie Tremblay, his wife, comes in from the vegetable garden to make supper for a hungry family.
In a time when everything seemed desperately urgent, this film took most of a year to shoot. Romantic, certainly, even sentimental. It turned an idealized lens on a world that most Canadians, Protestant Anglophones, regarded with xenophobic suspicion.
Out of the earth a heritage, the way of the father and the grandfather and the way of the son.
With neither electricity nor gasoline, the Tremblays fulfill nearly all their needs from just 40 acres of rolling land.
Through the winter, Marie is busy at her loom. A growing family needs plenty of cloth to clothe and cover it. Passing the shuttle back and forth, she gossips with Aunt Therese.
As well as weaving their own cloth and baking with their own flour in a 200-year-old oven. They even make soap, just as the first settlers did.
Into the boiling water goes the concentrate of bones and grease that Marie has boiled down during the winter.
Unlike many films that feel like an illustrated list assigned by a writer, Jane Marsh gives us something layered and humane that feels as authentic today as it must have in the 1940s.
Testing the mixture for Grand Père in a bowl of cold water, her hand can feel the clean substance of the soap, something new and useful that has been made.
Here was the documentary vision at its purest, the celebration of virtuous labor for its own sake, finding the heroic in the mundane. And it was an early hint at the future of documentary, when films would no longer be shot to fit a script, but rather cut, that is, edited, to reflect the story that the camera found. The painterly cinematography of Judith Crowley contributes as much as Marsh's direction to the lasting appeal of this respectful and affectionate portrait.
Unto thee shall all flesh come, who provideth them with corn when the earth is prepared, who watereth her furrows abundantly, who maketh it soft with showers and blessed the springing thereof.
Though official constraints meant that Marsh could never even mention the subject, this little gem offers insights into rural Quebec's resistance to conscription. Long abandoned and ignored by their mother country, what were Europe's tired quarrels to them? What had their lives to do with blitzkrieg or bomber swarms? If you got no audience, you got no show. The 1940s, of course, were the golden age of movie theaters, and the Film Board's news-based series did very well in this market. The audience wanted excitement, and the world in action delivered. At its peak, 40 million people a month watched each episode worldwide, and theaters paid the going rate to show them. But for most of their films, with their focus on education and the everyday, the Bijou's box office was not impressed. So John Grierson turned to an idea that had been pioneered in Nazi Germany and successfully transplanted to Britain. If the audience isn't coming to your films, take your films to the audience.
All across rural Canada, off the beaten track of commercial theaters, the movies travel the highways. Here in Wakefield, Quebec, is a scene duplicated in 80 different places at once all over our country. It's the day when the National Film Board Traveling Theatre comes to town.
With a speed and efficiency that seems only possible in times of emergency, the board built a nationwide network of monthly circuits, each with about 20 stops. The routine often included a daytime screening for schools and another in the evening. The wartime appetite for information and entertainment meant the monthly visit became a much anticipated event.
Meanwhile, trucks and buses bring in children from neighboring communities to enjoy the pictures too. And down the kids troop to the basement. What's playing today? Well, the program's got variety. It should be good. So turn the switch and let her go.
The circuit projectionists were expected to be self-sufficient, carrying everything they needed except 4 walls and a roof. They inspected and cared for their film, kept their equipment functioning, and did whatever was necessary to complete their appointed rounds. Arnold Perry's circuit, up BC's Sunshine Coast, required a series of boats and ferries and a good working knowledge of generators. In rural Quebec, Bill Ritchie had to get a fire going in the hall, clean up the room, black out the windows, and do his own advertising. In return, he became the most popular guy in town. Every day and every night, this scene was being repeated all over Canada to literally tens of thousands of people. Their reach was prodigious. In some areas, these were the first so-called talking pictures people had ever seen. The program usually began with a film on war matters, perhaps Forward Commandos, a film designed to show that though our armies might not be invading France yet, they were taking the war to Hitler. In this case, through occupied Norway.
And in the most northerly sphere of war, amid icebergs bearing down from the pole, Canadian troops, trained in the new methods, make their daring descent on Spitsbergen.
Many said they came to these screenings hoping to catch a glimpse of a loved one in the shots from overseas.
Hey, come on, everybody. We've got her.
Following this, something that spoke to a local audience. Maybe early start about farm programs for youth promoting modern techniques and looking to the next generation to lead the way.
Well, you two are on your own now.
Yep. Hello, Lottie.
The message to their elders was delivered with tact and humor.
By the end of the summer, we've seen a lot of things that could be improved around the place. And we've started to learn a more business-like way of running a farm. Sometimes we can even tell Dad a few things about farming. But then he doesn't always take to them right away.
Where do you got this, huh?
I keep track of everything about Lottie in here, and especially all the feed costs. When she starts giving milk, I can tell exactly how much I'm making on her.
Looks like a lot of foolishness to me.
Then another month passes.
What are you doing here?
Just jotting down some of the weights of the cow's milk.
How's Bessie doing?
Oh, she's up about 5 pounds from last week.
That's good.
The faces in these photographs reflect something more than mere entertainment. These films spoke directly to their lives. No wonder they flocked to the monthly visit, ready to drink in whatever the film board was dispensing. After the feature on local interest, there would be a film on some other part of Canada, maybe Alexis Tremblay, and then one on some dreary but important topic like rationing or price control, or maybe Norman McLaren's graphic warning that there was, after all, a war on.
I'm the guy who overhears what you say and passes it on to the enemy.
Any news from Jim? I'm not supposed to say this, but he must be sailing by now. That's quick.
Very helpful, ladies. Just look at the result.
Boy, if Hitler knew what we loaded into that warehouse today.
Yeah, what a place for a firebug.
Maybe it was you, lady, who gossiped. or you, sir, whoever it was, the Axis wishes to thank you for your magnificent service. Carry on, gossipers and blabbers. Your careless remarks will kill Canadians.
Encouraged by the success of the rural circuits, Grierson created the industrial and union circuits, whose theaters were cafeterias, union halls, and shop floors across the country. More tens of thousands of eyeballs, by war's end approaching 500,000 viewers a month across Canada, all getting the same message. The National Film Board was truly shaping a nation's view of itself. Despite a professed suspicion of propaganda, we were, as Grierson had predicted, lapping it up, especially when its message was democracy and Canada itself. In January of 1943, Grierson was named General Manager of the Wartime Information Board, charged with coordinating all government communications and publicity. He would remain head of the Film Board, but with such a full plate, his boys and girls would be largely on their own. No matter. By now they were as well trained as any of the troops. Throughout the war, they continued to commit propaganda by omission. Watch their whole output, and you won't see a political problem, a pessimistic opinion, or a downbeat ending. There was never a conscription crisis, and the debacle at Dieppe never happened. To modern eyes, some of their efforts to paper over blemishes has exactly the opposite effect. This is especially true in their treatment of non-Anglo-Saxons. The Canadian mosaic was what we called multiculturalism in Grierson's day. Then as now, we could be smug about our acceptance of difference in our fellow citizen. Then as now, the reality was more complicated. Anti-Semitism was a casual fact of life. When Grierson complained to a producer that there were too many Jews in his unit, the surprised response was, "There is only me and one other." "That's too many," Grierson responded. Even if it went no further, this remark speaks volumes about prevailing attitudes. The mosaic was highly selective. Asians were flatly unwelcome and held to a trickle. The only wartime images of recognizably Chinese Canadians I found were a couple of audience shots from the circuits. In my search for the Canada that my generation would inherit, no films were more revealing than those on what I call outsiders. Well-intended or not, they put an official stamp on popular prejudice and demonstrate the real dangers of a single, unchallenged information source. To start with, the more you resembled us, meaning Western Europeans, especially the British, the more probably you'd like what you saw.
Today, 1/5 of the whole Icelandic race lives on the Canadian prairies. On 1,000 fertile farms, Canadian Icelanders till a soil richer than their forefathers knew. Icelanders have quickly assimilated the farming methods of the country. These men are now typical Canadian farmers.
That's not a phrase I ever heard in films about Eastern Europeans, which tended to focus on what was exotic and different. That, after all, was what made Canada a mosaic and not a melting pot.
Scythes for the men and smaller sickles for the women were their only tools, and the stalks were bound into bundles with twists of straw.
They had a fondness for filming ritual, especially church processions. Surely as thrilling to audiences then as they are now. Then there was the thorny issue of the so-called belligerent nationalities. German Canadians got off relatively easily.
Lunenburg is German by blood, but completely British by conviction.
This was convenient, as it meant we didn't have to put them all in the slammer for the duration. But in December 1941, we got a new problem, and the world in action addressed it head-on with an extra-strength dose of Lorne Greene's narration.
The soldiers of the rising sun are little men, quick and wiry. Their uniforms are slovenly. Their faces, even in the heat of battle, are tawny masks, blank, expressionless. They believe that they have embarked upon a holy war, a war of liberation. Convince the Japs that we also do not fear to die, and the false mask of arrogance will fall forever from the double face of Nippon.
Okay, overheated rhetoric about the enemy is one thing, but turning it on your fellow Canadians is quite another.
Patrolling 5,000 miles of rock-toothed coast from Vancouver to Alaska. That's the job of the Fishermen Reserve. They've taken over boats once owned by Japanese fishermen who learned to know our coastline so dangerously well. And now these same ships see that no Japs get near our coast. They found an old Japanese newspaper aboard. Nothing for it but to show our deep admiration. Here come the Navy's painters. That ship's got to get a decent name. Or at least a proper number. Now she's a full-fledged member of Canada's Navy of 500 ships.
Only one film even tries to seem sympathetic.
With war in the Pacific now a reality, it came to acute nationwide attention that Canada had 23,000 residents of Japanese racial descent.
In 1944, the Department of Labor sponsored this film designed to help with post-war reconciliation. At first glance, it's civil and even accommodating. But a little decoding reveals a case of doublethink worthy of George Orwell.
A very large proportion lived in buildings entirely unsuitable for human use. All too frequently, this was the case in the small fishing villages. Sewage disposal was elementary in the extreme, and the unsanitary conditions resulting were the cause of much poor health.
The film implies, without ever stating it, that these conditions were what led to banishing thousands to unwinterized shacks in the mountains.
The Harris Ranch settlement. This is one of the most beautifully situated and also one of the healthiest spots. It is built on a sunny bluff high above the Slocan Lake.
And when is an internment camp not an internment camp? Apparently, when it's a relocation district.
It should be made clear that Japanese residents in these towns are not living in internment camps. Travel between towns in the same group is not restricted.
On the other hand,
for Japanese, travel to points outside of the general relocation district is by permit. There are roadblocks on all highways leading away from the areas. At these points, permits held by Japanese are checked and all traffic is inspected. Guards with bayonets and barbed wire fences have not been necessary.
In Japan, of course, Canadian prisoners and internees were being treated far worse than this. But these were our fellow citizens, entitled to due process, and we were not Japanese fascists. It would take our government 45 years to acknowledge the injustice. When your history is rooted in invasion and colonization, the ultimate outsiders are those whose land you have appropriated. And in almost all their films on indigenous peoples, the people themselves are outsiders to the point of being aliens, curiosities from faraway places to be stared at and talked about.
But they are sturdy and cheerful, these squat Aborigines, with deep reserves of vigor and intelligence to keep them alive in the Arctic and to tide them.
When it came to Inuit, that just about sums up the southern attitude.
Tribes border the coast.
And it doesn't change much when the action moves to a more familiar Dene community.
At Ray, on the north shore of Great Slave Lake, Yellowknife Indians gather to meet the doctor from Resolution, who comes to them as Indian agent with his party. A conference is held to consider their problems, the whole story of change forced by natural laws on an ancient, primitive people. When this country was ours, the chief says, there was plenty of game for food and clothing. Now, many of us are sick, and others are often hungry. Yet the police tell us sometimes not to hunt certain animals in certain seasons. What do we do then if we see a moose in closed season and we are hungry? We don't want you to be hungry, the agent answers him. The game regulations are meant to keep the game for the Indians. If you must shoot an animal out of season to keep from starving, you should report it right away to the nearest mounted policeman, and it'll be all right. But the payment of treaty is today what concerns the Indians. The crisp new dollar bills are counted, parceled out, and passed across the table to the eager brown hands of the tribesmen.
Unlike films on farming or urban issues, these were clearly never expected or intended to be seen by their subjects. It is, of course, the filmmakers who are on the outside, presenting the official view with neither curiosity nor comment. Unfortunately, wartime films like these helped shape attitudes for a whole generation of school children, my generation, who would grow up on a steady diet of National Film Board productions.
The mission schools have a big job to do, to train the minds and bodies of native children, to teach them health and hygiene and useful sciences. These are the young natives of the North, new generation of a changing race.
Happily, there is one shining exception to all this official condescension. A film that showed how it could, and one day would, be done. Fur Country is the only film to portray a native individual in any detail.
George McLeod, progressive Indian, trapper and dog team freighter in winter, boat mechanic and guide in summer, leaves next day for his trap lines at Hannah Bay, some 50 miles up the coast.
Hannah Bay is 2 days' travel by dog team. George supplements his income by taking mail and goods back and forth for the Hudson's Bay manager.
George, in white man fashion, kisses his children goodbye, and then, stolidly, Indian style, shakes hands with his wife. The driving call of "Hurrah, hurrah!" turns the team left along the tide mark of the Moose River, where high tides have overflowed and frozen in a wide, smooth band.
Soon enough, George runs into tough sledding.
Ice conditions like this are usual on the winter bay, when abruptly, without warning, bright northern skies in December darken, bring angry wind and storms.
This film board crew was willing to do whatever it took to get an authentic story. There were no snowmobiles or helicopters to drop them into George's journey, then whisk them back for dinner at the hotel. Director Edward Buckman went where George went, and cameraman Doug Sinkler somehow coaxed his camera to keep rolling in the James Bay cold. When, after a night camped on the shoreline, George finally reaches Hannah Bay, he's still a full day from his trapline.
Next morning, George starts for his trapline 25 miles away in the bush. Once on snowshoes, George is able to move with ease over deep drifts to cover 15, 20, 25 miles a day.
The trapline circuit takes 3 more days, and the filmmakers are right there with him. George barricades a whole stream to trap 1 beaver, which, with mink and silver fox, will bring $50 to $75. Not a bad haul in the 1940s. And their meat feeds him out on the line.
Rewarded again, another $5 or $10. Pack stack still heavier, George continues around his line. Trap sprung, reset it.
The enormous effort of George's winter routine is recognized and respected by the filmmakers, probably because they literally did walk a mile, many miles in fact, in his footsteps. Like Alexis Tremblay, this film was both propaganda in the Grierson sense and something deeper and more genuine. In that, it was ahead of its time, something else it shared with the films of Alexis Tremblay's director, Jane Marsh. And Marsh herself was never more ahead of her time than when she turned her attention to women. World War II famously brought women out of the home and into the workplace by the tens of thousands. This would lead eventually to a groundswell of social change. But in the 1940s, women's traditional roles were largely intact. This was clearly an irritant to the young director. And that irritation crackles through in 2 films she made to promote women in the armed services.
From the Renaissance to the present day, women have taken their rightful place as the flower and ornament of the human race. To the amazing range of their physical beauty and grace, women have added those spiritual qualities we have all come to know and revere. Gaiety, affection, daring, modesty, intelligence, and the ability to use their intelligence to further enhance their beauty, making them the supreme object of man's admiration, of man's esteem. Ah, woman.
Ah, men make me tired. They never give women credit for any common sense at all. Why, look at Beth Clark. I've known her since we went to high school together. To look at Beth, you'd think she was just another of those famous butterflies. But she
Once again, Marsh worked within the mandate, but made the routine recruiting film a vehicle for gently acerbic feminism. She managed to show women doing very serious work while, just incidentally, taking men down a peg or two.
She'd driven her own car for years and soon picked up the secrets of that jitterbug of the transport world, the Jeep. The testing ground proved almost as tough a proposition for the instructor as it did for Beth, and they make them plenty tough. But hills, holes, and water to the contrary, they both came through smiling. Although Beth said the instructor hated losing his hat and a bit of his dignity.
In the Air Force, women were trained as target spotters, grading aircrew accuracy. Marsh's filmmaking skill brings urgency and excitement to what was probably a routine, though undoubtedly demanding, job.
And afterwards, how gratifying to male pride to stroll into the plotting office in the certainty that that third burst was a direct hit. And how disturbing to discover that air women, as well as mathematics, are accurate and tough.
There is no direct record of Grierson's response to Marsh's forays beyond the mandated message. But in 1944, they got into a disagreement that resulted in her resignation. He reportedly asked her back, but her mind made up, she left Ottawa and Canada for good, to what can only have been our great loss. Bitterly, Marsh later reflected that, quote, women at the NFB were so grateful to be working in interesting jobs that they didn't realize they were slaves.
History is indelibly recorded as never before. They produced shots like this taken by Bill Grant of the first Canadians going in on D-Day.
With the D-Day landings and the successes of summer 1944, it became realistic to think about a post-war world. A new wave of optimism swept the country. Sad and painful losses on the battlefield aside, Canada would only gain by wartime. Spectacular industrial and social advances were raising high hopes for the future.
In a single year, we have turned out 5,000 planes, Lancasters, Mosquitoes, Hurricanes.
from huge new plants established all across the country.
This optimism would express itself in grand plans for post-war development and pipe dreams like this.
The streamlined dream of the shining helicopter.
Yogi Berra was right. The future ain't what it used to be. At the Film Board, nothing caught this new spirit quite like this film.
Hanson, 12424, pull out. Make another circuit. TCA on final.
Flight 6 was made in the fall of 1944 to promote the brand new transatlantic airmail service.
Montreal Tower, clear to land, wheels down.
Director Sidney Newman brought an almost Hollywood flair to what could have been a deadly subject.
Now take this letter. Its story begins yesterday in Germany.
Okay, you guys, break for 10 minutes.
While his buddies grab a smoke, Bill looks at a dog-eared snapshot. It's the girl he wants to marry. He wrote last week and asked her, but already he's worrying for a reply and is beginning to think that maybe his pal Joe was right when he said women are poison. But it seems that a proposal is not easy to answer on paper. What with the search for the right word and inconvenient interruptions by the boss. With the letter written, it's an urgent matter to get it off on the next mail. By hook or by crook.
Democratic propaganda had gained considerable sophistication in just 4 short years, and battlefield success encouraged a lighter tone.
Flight 6 brings the promise of his future, a letter with a 10-cent airmail stamp, the good news from home.
The film's exuberant optimism cues us to the promise that's opening up everywhere in a war-weary world. Grierson saw opportunity in this new spirit. Never satisfied with merely cheerleading for democracy, his intent had always been to help shape it, in concert with the government he served. His chance had arrived. In Grierson's terms, they turned their hammer to forging the future. And here is where I begin to recognize the Canada of my own youth, a sharp departure from the lean, mean world of the 1930s. The forging begins modestly enough with Gudrun Bjering-Parker's sweet film, Before They Are 6, a powerful plea for the kids to get a little consideration amid the frantic wartime mobilization.
What happens to the children under 6 when mothers are at work? Mrs. Roberts leaves Roy with her landlady. Before going to work, she makes sure he won't be able to run out on the street. The landlady takes him in at mealtime. With a lonely patience, the children learn to wait with a listlessness that dulls young minds. So that these young lives will not be maimed, a nursery world has been created for them.
It's the first effort to establish what we now call a daycare system for preschoolers. And while it was introduced to answer wartime demands, it would continue as the post-war kindergarten movement.
Finally, the morning arrives when Mrs. Roberts takes Roy to the nursery. She begins to wonder, when a child is so young, should a mother leave him with strangers? After speaking to the nursery supervisor, Mrs. Roberts realizes she is not leaving Roy with strangers, but rather with friends who understand the problems of a working mother.
So Roy's mom is free to spend the day making high explosives with an easy mind. The intention is to inform and to persuade. This is the beginning of a new approach to government, as an active instrument to build community and extend democracy, rather than just a policeman and collector of customs. This new role required trust and support from Canadians as a whole. And films like this were intended to build that trust.
When Mrs. Roberts calls for Roy at the end of the day, she always finds him busy and happy. The nursery supervisors are his friends, and Mrs. Roberts is glad to find they haven't taken Roy's affection from her.
See, you can trust us. And behind this, a larger message. You have a right to a better world, and your government can help make it happen. The money behind this message was the baby bonus, the family allowance plan of 1944.
Now $1.5 million checks a month go out to Canada's parents.
About $6 a month per child, at a time when minimum wage was less than $20 a week, helped with food, clothing, and medical bills for those who would have been on their own 5 years earlier.
When the monthly checks started coming in, it seemed like a gift from heaven. And of course, I took Paul to the doctors right away.
This new theme reaches its logical conclusion in rural health, showcasing a cradle-to-grave health care scheme being offered to depressed rural communities by the Manitoba government. It promised support in everything from public health inspectors to hospital modernization, to family doctors, education, immunization, and counseling. Films like this were literally the Grierson vision in action, turning dry government reports into tangible images. In them, we can see the nation we could, and for a time almost did, become. A compassionate community where the welfare of each depends on the welfare of all.
Every child will have his rightful chance to live a happy and useful life.
This message, too, went out to all corners of the Canadian community, further conditioning post-war expectations. Alas for John Grierson, this new departure would finally lead to the breakdown of his crucial partnership with Prime Minister Mackenzie King. For Grierson's vision of a new world went well beyond Canada's borders. And with producer Stuart Legg, he was taking the World in Action series away from the conduct of the war toward the shape of the peace. Even before the war ended, they began preaching a new world order to the tens of millions who watched their monthly features.
To make this reconstruction possible, the New World will be called upon to provide basic supplies for Europe during at least 2 years after the cessation of hostilities. In the first 6 months alone, Europe will need 5 million tons of wheat to be provided mostly from the farms of Canada.
Trouble is, statements like that one sound very much like a declaration of foreign policy, a prerogative jealously guarded by the Prime Minister. In making them on their own, Grierson and Legg were presuming on the boss's support. Bad idea. In Our Northern Neighbor, Stuart Legg, always an enthusiastic supporter of Soviet-Canadian friendship, once again crossed the line, declaring a path for Canadian foreign policy.
And as together with our Russian neighbors, we face the coming years, we say we met in determination. We march on, friends, in fact, in spirit, and in purpose.
Hardly a description of the half-century that lay ahead. Again, he caught the attention of the Prime Minister, and not in a good way. Finally, in a film on the post-war fate of Greece, they advocated a policy directly contrary to Britain's, effectively a slap in the face for Winston Churchill. At Prime Minister King's orders, the film was killed and its prints destroyed. Was this the turning point? If he could no longer count on King's full support, Grierson was just another public servant. At the very least, the fun had gone out of the job. In May of 1945, the war in Europe ended. And now the urgency had gone as well. No one got fired, no one stomped out. But the rumors swirled and the memos flew through the summer of 1945. And on August 10th, John Grierson handed in a short but gracious resignation and almost immediately left for New York to, as they say, pursue new opportunities. He had come with the war, and with peace restored, he left. Others would fill his office, but no one would ever quite fill the space he left. And to make absolutely sure of that, Mackenzie King ignored Grierson's choice of successor and instead appointed Ross McLean, a career public servant and a man you could rely on. He had, as he would say himself, left the National Film Board in good working order. Quote, fully equipped and working 100% to schedule on an enormous production program. The place feels good. The people are purposeful and not arty, and they know how to work. They are making the documentary idea an integral part of Canadian life. History has labeled them pioneers and idealists, and they were certainly both of those. But they had their share of detractors, both inside government and out. Quebec was understandably incensed that French-language production had been almost non-existent, and at the portrayal of the province as quaint and backward-looking. Regional resentments, always near the boil, were not helped by stereotyped and simplistic portrayals of East and West. As a son of the prairies, I understand these objections, as well as those with much more serious grievances. But the fact is that all of these issues, racism, intolerance, and regional bias, are with us still. And the crucial thing is that we continue to address them. I went looking for their portrayal of the Canada I had been born into, less than a year after John Grierson left. And I found it, with rather more warts and rather less art than I had expected. Yet, obvious as they seem now, these flaws have only become apparent through hindsight. Far more significant to post-war history, and especially to my generation, is that they had mapped the country on film, and in doing so, had connected with their audience in a bond that would last for decades. Indeed, over the years, that connection would make them the envy of the documentary world and a leader in developing the genre. Their ideas and techniques would shape every branch of Canadian filmmaking, from television news to the style of TV and theatrical dramas. So pervasive is their influence that some have called the documentary Canada's national art form. John Grierson is the perfect Canadian hero. Plenty of flaws, and not even Canadian. He believed that just showing us Canada on film would convince us of its greatness. His greatness lay in that vision, and in the force of will that saw it realized. He sent his boys and girls out to take us by the throat, and by almost any measure, they succeeded. In fact, despite 75 years of supposed sophistication since, I find their propaganda still pretty hard to resist.
are thinking more than ever of this, our homeland. For each of us, the Canadians, some corner of this land is home. Home is a fishing village of the Maritimes, Peggy's Cove, Indian Harbor. Home is 1,000 miles to the west, on the prairies. The ranch lands of the foothills. Home is a city. Halifax, St. John, the Narrows of Vancouver, Victoria. Somewhere in this vast land, for us is home. Somewhere here are our roots. But we no longer think only of our own town or district or province. Home is all of Canada. We know it better now. We are bound to it by memories we share. Hot summers, the sparkle of winter, hockey night,